technical difficulties. We were originally supposed to go live on Sunday, ended up rescheduling it for today because I wanted to give folks enough time to get Ryan Coogler's sinners out the way and to do the homework because I did discuss that I wanted us to look at the archetypes of Black women in that film and tie it into self care. I've been doing an ongoing mini series, so to speak, regarding self care for Black women and what that needs to look like, especially in the decolonized version, which is what we need today. Hi, everyone. My name is Tonier. I am the self care maven here on this channel. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I help Black women liberate and reclaim their health and wellness through decolonialized self care that is tailored and equipped for Black women. And if you are a Black woman, welcome and thank you for joining me today. Now, I wanted to, revisit some topics, well, not topics so much as archetypes in the context of self care. Now, I've previously talked about self care and how it is promoted in mainstream media, in dominant culture, if you will, a version of self care that is arguably harmful for us as Black people, inaccessible to us for a myriad of reasons. And if you haven't been following me previously, you can read or rather go through the previous videos I have done on self care and what that should look like for us as Black people and particularly as Black women. In the previous video, I also discussed of different types of archetypes of Black women, if you will, as adaptive strategies, living in a space where you intersect so many forms of oppression as a Black woman living in a Black body. There is, discrimination, there is systemic racism, misogyny, patriarchy, all of these systems unfortunately impact us as Black women. And so, again, the question becomes, well, how do you counteract the negative, harmful effects to your health and well being, not just your physical well being, but your mental, spiritual, emotional well being as a Black woman living in systems of oppression? And so, I really wanted us to, do that homework where we went to go look at Ryan Coogler's Sinners and just take into account all of what they were dealing with, drawing parallels between our lived experience, the lived experiences of our ancestors, what they went through, not even, so many generations ago. My mom used to say her feet were literally inches and a couple of years from the plantation because if you followed me before, hello, welcome again. My name is Tonya Barango. I'm a self-care maven here, and I help Black women over 40 look better, feel better without the pressure, get off the altar of other people's expectations, reclaiming your health and wellness with decolonized self-care, because that is the antidote to what we as Black women experience here, the harmful effects of living under systemic discrimination and racism and other forms of oppression. Now, back to what I was saying. If you've been following me for a little while here and on Instagram, I've given a little bit of my backstory where I talk about how I have the unique perspective of having ties both here in the US of A, in the New World, on this continent, as well as on the home continent of Africa. Half of my family's from there, half of my family's here from the US. And my mom used to always say her feet were literally just a few years from the sharecropper's field. Why did she say that? Because her mother, both of her parents came from the South. And on her mother's side, my great grandmother was half Choctaw Indian. So I have the native indigenous on that side, but then on the other side, I have the indigenous African side as well, because my family, on the my father's side is West African. We're from Nigeria. That's a whole nother story. But bottom line is, when you look at systems of oppression and you look at this film, I drew some parallels between what was experienced at that time, and we look at what is going on now. And a number of us had this discussion offline where we talked about what's changed and what hasn't changed. And sadly, most of us arrived at the same conclusion that not a lot has changed. It's a lot of parallels between what Stack and Smoke talked about when they were living in Chicago, the plantation that was Chicago versus the plantation they knew in the South. And similarly, the same can be said when it comes to our experiences as Black people now versus what was going on then. You didn't have the overt, active, full on in your face version of violence that was experienced at that time, but arguably we still experience that now. So in the context of self-care, when I speak of self-care for Black women, it's very important again that we, have some correlations here. What happened? What was some of the consequences that were experienced, not just as the community of Black people, when you don't gatekeep or when you're not self-aware enough to protect certain things that should be protected in your community? How does that impact other people in the community and you as an individual? So there's an individual aspect as well as a communal aspect. And when I speak of self-care, I'm talking about our practices as Black people that we brought with us from our ancestors, or rather, what our ancestors brought with them, practices and ways of doing and ways of healing, ways of comforting, and ways of uplifting. These were all aspects of self care that they brought with them from the continent. And we have this. Push and pull where you're trying to hold on to practices. And then again, we have this tendency as a people to, I don't know if it's just us as a people or if it's just human nature to sometimes take things for granted and not be protective as you should be. Now, how does that relate to self care? I spoke before in a previous live and a couple other videos back where I was talking about the version of self-care that is largely promoted in, mainstream media and dominant culture is very exploitative. It is very commercialized, very capitalistic, and really, really disconnected from its individual origins and parts, largely because these were colonized indigenous practices that were put together in a hodgepodge zombified quilt, if you will. I like to use that term, zombified quilt, where things are appropriated from other groups around the world, other modalities for healing and collective knowing and healing and comfort and upliftment that have been commodified, and they have no real, they've lost their actual meaning. And you wonder why, when we as Black people, particularly Black women, go into spaces that weren't built for us, and we find that, okay, one, you're in a lot of instances, I've seen this conversation going on threads where, Black women are sharing their experiences of going to yoga studios where they felt again like they were other, like they were the only Black person in that yoga studio, and things were just, the energy was just off. And again, I say, why go into spaces that were not built for you? So now we have instances where you're already in protective mode. You've been in survival mode, going to toxic workplaces, dealing with microaggression, all forms of various forms of oppression or discrimination, simply because the institutions of this country And this part of this world, the society that we live in, is built on structures of oppression. And so we're constantly navigating that in our day to day, moving on. So, how do you expect, again, to go into a space that arguably is for you to self care, but you go into a space that also has the same systems and structures around it, and you think that you're going to get some kind of healing or relief there? And so, again, this ties into, that whole culture of vampiristic um, idea around appropriating different things from different cultures, and none of them having any real coherency or meaning or any real power behind them, because what? They've been disconnected from their original forms. And so when it comes to self-care for us as Black women, we have to decolonize. We need a version. We have to practice a version of self care that is culturally relevant for us, that that really ministers to us from a cultural, spiritual, and community perspective. And that necessarily is something, those practices, those modalities of healing and self nurturing, they have to be protected. Why? Because we already exist in a space that is opportunistic, that is discriminatory and exploitative. And so I wanted my whole reason for one of my reasons for just, telling folks, hey, go watch Coogler's Sinners, was because I wanted us to tap into that understanding and that awareness. Part of, like I've always said, one of the key elements to beginning a self care journey that is meaningful, that is sustainable, and is truly connected and rooted to you and your people and your background and all of that, that is culturally relevant as a healing practice and protective practice for you, is you have to have an awareness of all of the things that are operating on you situationally, both internally and externally, as a Black woman. I've said it before. We live in a society that is very capitalistic, and it's that capitalism is built on exploitation and oppression. Those are things we have to, when you begin any kind of healing journey and to wholeness and reclaiming, or rather reclamation, you have to start from a perspective of self awareness. You cannot know what needs to be addressed, what is actually going on internally, what is contributing to your dis ease, if you have no self awareness of your situation. Next thing I've always said is, you have to do the mental and emotional work, the internal work, to maintain all of that. That means you have to unpack all of the stuff that's leached into you from, as a consequence of living under various systems of oppression. There is no way existing in the current society that we exist in, because no one exists in a bubble, really. That's just fantasy. And so, because of the society that we live in, we necessarily, or rather, as a consequence of that, being a human being in a Black body, existing in a society such as this, you are unconsciously going to absorb that anti Blackness. Some of that racism is going to leach in. There's no way that it doesn't. Sometimes we catch ourselves with saying things to one another, and even to ourselves in community with other Black women and other Black people. We say things that you're like, that was crazy. And you check yourself and you say, hey, that's, something that's not, It's not right. And it's something that is anti you. And so you have to unpack that. So that's part of, or rather, it should be part of any Black person's self care and wholeness and all of those things that need to happen on the inside in order for you to reclaim who you are and heal and have your self care journey and your whole self care toolkit in place that's effective and that's sustainable. If you're doing what, mainstream media is doing, everything to distance you from, from the money in your bank account, because that's essentially what it is. It's all very, most of it is very capitalistic, and it's, like I said, it's exploitative, and by extension, a lot of that stuff, they throw things at you and say, if you buy this, if you buy this, if you buy that, if you do this, if you go here, oh, you will feel better. And that's self care. No, it's not. There's a difference between the occasional self indulgence and actual meaningful self care, which is restorative, which is healing, and it encompasses the mind, body, and spirit, the wholeness, the totality of you as a human being. You're refilling your cup, you're nurturing. Every organism on this planet practices self care. Unfortunately, we as humans are the only ones who seem to get it wrong in a number of instances. And that is by virtue of the fact that we unfortunately deal with a lot of inequity and various systems of oppression globally. And that largely affects the non white people. And additionally, in particular, Black people and Black women on top of that. So, as you can see, and as I've discussed in previous videos and lives where I talk about the fact that in the real world that we live in, Black women need strategies and have developed strategies historically to navigate systems of oppression. We've come with ways to survive Jim Crow, like in Ryan Coogler's Sinners. We've come up with ways to stay in community with each other as best we can so that we can survive to the next generation and hopefully have a better quality of life. Now in 2025, we find ourselves in a situation, in a state where not only are legislation that our people bled and everything for to get us this level of progress, but a lot of this is being rolled back. But outside of that, that is politically political, we still have to contend with the systems of oppression. We still have to contend with not just those policies that affect us, but at a larger level in terms of community. And then when you get to the individual level, we see where our health outcomes are not looking too great, in spite of all the progress that we have allegedly made up to this point. And so it's time now, and the data is out there. The articles have been written, academia has done its work to say, hey, what we thought was working, what worked for our mothers, say what was fine, what they used as adaptive strategies to navigate racism and other systems of oppression in this country, what they used before, that may have worked pretty okay for them at that time. But we see now where those structures that we put in place, those survival tactics and strategies that we were using, that we were trying to adapt into a version of self care or extract some level of self care from, all of that is breaking down. And it's breaking down at an alarming rate. Why? Because We are in a time too where things in this country have regressed. They continue to regress, and they're regressing at a level that many of us did not anticipate. Those of us who voted last year, the majority of Black people who are typically the canaries in the coal mine, the people that see the writing on the wall first, because what, when the rest of the world, when white America catches a cold, we get pneumonia. So historically this has been the case, and it's the data bears this out throughout all studies globally. The typically in the times of conflict, political unrest, war, famine, whenever you have those times of turbulence in society, regardless of where you are in the world, the most vulnerable populations usually are, most of the time, women, children, and the elderly. Now, when you add on the systems of oppression that we deal with and the points of intersectionality that we as Black women deal with, you see how ugly that can get really quickly. And so now that those strategies that we were using previously to get around, to manage, you had the archetype of the sisterella that I talked about. You had the archetype of the strong Black woman. We talked about that. We talked about some other archetypes before. I'm not going to go through all of them because I went through those in previous videos, but the ones to really focus on that I think most of us are very well versed on is the superwoman, strong Black woman, sisterella, the social justice warrior. All of these are archetypes and were ways and strategies that we used previously to navigate systems of oppression that we live under in this society. However, that's not working. The research that's been done by so many gifted article writers, researchers in Black health and safety, and even by in the NIH, CDC, all of these publications are showing the same data. And for someone like me and others who work in healthcare, I work on the laboratory side of healthcare. I've spoken about that before. And it's very disheartening to see when you, regardless of rate, regardless of socioeconomic class, the health outcomes for Black women and Black people are still grim. And that has to do with structural and systemic racism that we deal with. And and so this is why I am so passionate about making sure that we have a version of self-care that collectively ties back into our culture as a people, that is culturally relevant and taps into the healing modalities that we have lost generationally over time. Practices like hoodoo that are rooted in Africa and other parts of the diaspora, those are all healing modalities that it's time to reclaim all of that that was, how do I say it, appropriated by other groups. Um, and you know who I'm talking about. I'm not going to get into the weeds about that, but our systems and ways of doing things are have to be by definition different from what everybody else is doing, because our culture as a people are different. Our needs are different as a people. There is a collective and communal aspect of our self-care that is critical to our individual practices of self-care. Additionally, that self-care the decolonized version of self-care, where you've unpacked whiteness, where you've decoupled um, capitalism and uh, exploitative themes and ways of doing things that are disconnected from environment, different disconnected from our ancestral connections to the earth, to healing, to ways of doing and knowing. When you reclaim all of that is when you begin the real healing, is when you begin to get back in alignment and back into balance as a people and as individuals. But it also requires a huge aspect of what I like to call protectionism. Some call it gatekeeping. And I'm going to hark back to, again, Ryan Coogler's message. One of the messages in that movie, Sinners, is the message of protection and gatekeeping your sacred practices. Remember, Annie, rather than give up, rather than lose that important power, knowledge, ways, and modalities that are intrinsically connected to us as a people, what did she opt for? She said, in the event that anything happened to her, where she was going to, she got bitten by or she was taken out by a vampire, rather than turn, make sure that she is dead, dead, so that none of that knowledge, none of those ways and practices of being are appropriated and misused by the vampires. And so there's that level of protectionism and safety, because when you're protective of your ancient and cultural practices too, in the context of self-care, that's you're automatically creating a place of safety. Why? Because those who shouldn't have access to that, you're gatekeeping that, you're keeping that necessarily the sacred, those cultural indigenous practices are being kept and protected. And because of that, the people who are tied and connected to those practices can actually benefit from that without running the risk of those practices being contaminated or poisoned by those who should not have access to those practices. And you see that in the ways outside of that film, when you look around what's going on in mainstream media with the little, Bali trips and all of that. Oh, this is such a great place. And you come back with these indigenous practices and then you rename them something else. You know who I'm talking about, the vampires, right? And completely remove all the context associated with that. And so there's no real connection or healing going on. Everything is very surface level and very superficial and disconnected. And when you have things like that, when you have practices that are so powerful and also so intrinsically connected to cultural ways of doing, those practices become harmful in the wrong hands. And also they become weaponized against the people that those practices were taken from. So that's something else, another element that I found interesting in Ryan Coogler's Sinners that I felt were applicable to the whole conversation of decolonized self-care, particularly self-care for us as Black people and Black women. So again, I just thought that was something we needed to address. But this was a conversation I felt was needed because I've been having that thought at the back of my head for a while now, where I was talking about, and I alluded to it and came right out in some of my videos and lives too, where I did say our version of self-care is one that needs to be gate kept, protected, because there's no way to truly be vulnerable and open yourself up to the level of healing and nurturing. There's no way to fully access that in a space that's not safe. That's why when you go to these studios that you're the only black person there, or or even if it's a gym that there are a couple of black people that go to that gym, but it's in an area that's not where your community is, you can't be fully vulnerable, you can't fully heal, you can't fully connect and lose yourself in the process of renewal and healing. That calls for safety. That level of vulnerability is necessary for you to have protection and safety, gatekeeping around those practices and around those spaces. So, if you want to truly heal and be connected in a way that is sustainable, truly healing, and culturally relevant, you have to actively, one, protect that space, create it, and again, protect it. And it has to be gate kept. And that's I will say, the elephant in the room a lot of people don't want to speak to, because they're playing respectability politics. They don't want to come off as seeming to be exclusionary. But guess what? In the animal kingdom, you will never see a group of antelope in a vulnerable setting not keeping an eye out for predators. So I don't understand why. I understand, and that's for another video. I take that back. I understand why people fall victim for that, particularly us as a people, because we're very community oriented, we're very open and inclusive. But that is a maladaptive strategy. Now that we have learned that essentially Black folk don't have allies, we have the elections from November of last year gave us the end data. Many of us already knew this, especially if you have people in your life and you've done that kind of activism anyway. You understand that allyship in the it's very much in the air, but in practice it's very thin on the ground, especially when it comes to us as Black people. So I think we finally learned that lesson, that it's time to start reclaiming, protecting, gatekeeping. That is something that we have to come back to, and it's necessary. And there's nothing wrong with it. I think some people are hesitant to fully embrace that because they feel like it might be too militant or whatever, or political. But the truth of the matter is that we are in a time now when strategies that we used previously have now become maladaptive for us as Black people, and particularly as Black women. Embracing that archetype of the strong Black woman, that resilience, that caring of everything, and prioritizing everyone else over your own health and well-being to your own detriment. That Let's let that go. Though a lot of these archetypes, these adaptive strategies, people do what they can do with the best they can with what they have in that particular time in history. Not judging, but I'm going to say that those strategies are maladaptive now. There's no more setting ourselves on fire to keep other people warm. That no longer works for us. That level of resiliency has become maladaptive to the point where that weathering effect is taking place. That effect of autoimmune dysfunction, um, disproportionate levels of chronic disease in our population as people, particularly as Black women. A lot of us showing up with those autoimmune diseases because we're holding on, we're internalizing stress, we're not doing the kind of self care that's necessary to address our needs as Black women to mitigate the effects of living under oppression in this society. That's got to stop. That Sisterella thing, that's got to stop. That centering of other people has got to stop. That centering of patriarchy and misogyny within our own community has got to stop as Black women. That's counterproductive to our health and well being. And I find that when I have discussions with us as a community, not just Black women, that tends to get uh, tense because what? You're calling for the dismantling of oppression or oppressive systems. And part of those oppressive systems are patriarchy, misogyny, which is very alive and well and strong in our community. And that's not just here in the diaspora, that it's also true on the continent. And that too is a root a lot of the problems too in Africa when it comes to disproportionate incidences of violence against women and girls, child marriage. All of these things are tied together. And so when it comes to, again, self care, we have got to let that go. And in order to let that go, you have to do the mental work. And I always say, as a women's self care and health coach for Black women, I that is not my sphere of expertise. And that's why I said, even as a health coach, I have to have a mental health professional to help me unpack my stuff so that I can continue my healing process, continue and maintain my self care. All of this is not to say that this is another thing, too, I want us to address is that notion of guilt, um, that conditioning within our community that doesn't allow for vulnerability and that doesn't allow for self prioritization. It's been demonized, if you will, especially when it comes to Black women. Oh, you're selfish. Oh, you're this or you're that. No. The greatest gift, the most selfless thing you can do as a Black woman is to prioritize your health and well being. Why? Because women are the center of community. If women are sick, if women are ailing, if women are experiencing dis-ease, guess what? That community is going to be sick. Who are the ones that build bridges, that create safe spaces? It's women. You can't escape that. And so, as many a airline um, flight attendant have said, in the event of an emergency and we lose cabin pressure, the mask are going to come down, the oxygen mask are going to come down from the ceiling. You're going to put your mask on first, then the next person next to you. And that's something that we as people, and particularly as women, have been conditioned not to do. We've been conditioned to carry the burden of everything and everyone else on our shoulders to our own detriment. And now we see the data, the long-term data, historically as well, in terms of the damage that that's doing. And now that all of these systems and things are currently in flux, culturally and politically, those tensions are exacerbated. The effects of those maladapt of the living in an oppressive society, one, those are amplified. The effects of utilizing maladaptive strategies, colonized so-called self-care strategies, become even more disturbing and disaligned from what we need. And so things like, oh, accessibility to self care avenues, if you will, the ability to take time off, the ability to make time for your own self care and nurturing, that gets impacted. And so all of these things are interconnected and they become even more complex to the point that people get overwhelmed and feel like there's no way out. But I'm here to tell you today that there is a way out. And the way to go forward, the way to have to amplify and improve your current situation, especially when it comes to your own health, healing, and self care as a Black woman in navigating what we're dealing with now, culturally, is the practice, a decolonized self care practice. And decolonized self care is sustainable. Why? Because it's culturally relevant. It meets you at your points of intersectionality as an individual and as a community. And that's what I wanted to drive home today in today's discussion. And I just thought it was interesting to pull in some parallels from Ryan Coogler's Sinners to talk about that and just have us keep our eyes on some of those archetypes that I discussed in that video, in a previous video, regarding like the sisterella, the strong Black woman, the social justice warrior, all of those things, all those archetypes, and identifying those patterns and characteristics in that film and what happened to those women in those instances. And I just thought it was an interesting thing to keep at the back of the mind, because this there's something to learn when it comes to consequences. What are the consequences of not doing self-care in the right way, in a way that is culturally relevant and appropriate for us as Black women? You have the real consequences of early death, chronic disease, and situational danger. That is also an issue. I don't talk too much about that because when I talk about self care, I talk about a number of aspects related to that. And part of that has to do with environment. And I've specifically said that, self care, the way it's promoted, the colonial version of self care, doesn't address environment or anything related to cultural relevance or the people that it's operating on. And there are instances where, when it comes to self care, to really practicing it in a way that is meaningful and that is effective, one of those components might be an actual geographical switch where you're changing your geographic location as an aspect of healing. I strongly believe that you cannot effectively self care and heal if you continue to do this in a toxic environment. Now, there's some ways to mitigate the effects of a toxic environment and still practice a self care that is beneficial and is healing, and it does mitigate some of the effects of what we experience living in bodies in this society. But I'm not going to gloss over the fact that one of those strategies might include an actual move of location, whether that's moving to a different state, whether that's leaving the country. I know some people have made the choice to exit the US as a Black person for a better way of life. And I'm not going to lie, that is something I have on the table for myself. But not everybody, not every Black person will have the privilege of being able to do that. And that's something that we all have to, do our own calculations on. But when it comes to the actual beginning stages, beginning your self care journey as a Black woman, that is something that is secondary to your immediate situation. And that's why I said, your self care must be decolonized. And that part of that decolonized process, that decolonized form of self care, must be culturally relevant, one, but it's an internal work that needs to be done too. Um, when it comes to here in the diaspora, it's unpacking that anti Blackness and what my mom, God rest her soul, used to call the plantation Negro syndrome. It is a real thing. And she used to talk about that. I'll never forget when my granddad, when he was alive as well, she used to sit at his feet, and I, being the kid, nosy kid that I was, I'd be listening in, and they would have those discussions about, because she was a Pan Africanist as well, and she was in the movement. And so those were conversations I was privy to as a child when they were talking about things like unpacking anti Blackness before that was even a thing. And they used to discuss that thing called plantation Negro syndrome. And then I remember on the continent and Nigeria being saying, Pan Africanist there as a kid saying, oh, you need to decolonize your mindset. You need to unpack that colonial mindset, or otherwise, in very coarse language, rough translation, I'll never forget a family friend having the discussion of, he called it black people aping the white man. That was his, that was a family friend who was very revolutionary in his thinking. But this was back in the day before that was even a thing in terms of how we describe that now. And so, again, back to self care. Our version of self care has to include that. You can't escape that. And I don't care how much anybody wants to say that, any black person wants to say, or any black woman wants to say, I'm not anti black. Girl, I hate to break it to you, but you cannot exist in this space growing up as a child in this country, even as an adult, or coming to this country at any stage of life where you have not been impacted by oppression and the structures of oppression that have been in place to make you unconsciously internalize this stuff, this poison. You cannot live next to a smokestack, no pun intended to the Ryan Coogler movie, but your community cannot be next to a smokestack and you not think your lungs are going to be impacted by the toxins and the smoke coming from that smokestack. So that is a reality of being black in America and being a black person on this planet, because anti-blackness is global, oppression is global. We see all of these systems in operation now, but that's a larger discussion. I'm talking about specifically black women here in the diaspora specifically, and as a collective globally. These are things that we have to navigate as a people and as women, for our own safety, for our own well being, for our own health and wellness. And in order to stop the damaging effects of these oppressive systems, we again must practice our version of self care, which is decolonized, culturally relevant, and helps us decouple, decenter all that ish and get that outside of us so that we can reclaim and renew ourselves and be in community with each other, lifting up each other, and of course, living our best lives. Because, yes, again, black don't crack, but black can be impacted by the negative effects of systemic oppression. Because while we might look good outside physiologically, the skin is glowing or whatever, you're internalizing all that stress and all of that harm internally without addressing any of that. That affects all of your organs, that affects your body chemistry, it affects you on so many levels internally. And so you might be, phenotypically you might be looking like you're 45, but internally, because of the weathering effects of the trauma that's carried on generationally, the impact of living in oppressive systems that are intersectional, you might be coming up on 60 inside. So we don't want any of that. We want to stop that cycle. It's time in 2025 that we break that cycle of destruction. And so I'm going to leave it right there. And thank you for tuning in with me. Again, my name is Tonya. I'm a self-care maven. I help Black women over 40 decolonize their self care and enjoy their lives in a healthy and sustainable manner that is truly connected and rooted in reclaiming who we are as a people and our liberation as women, because that's who we are and that's who we've always been. So till next time, thank you for tuning in. Drop your comments on what do you think, what did you think of the women, the archetypes of women that you witnessed in Ryan Coogler's Sinners, and share some of your thoughts, because I'm actually going to go watch it again. A number of people are finding so many themes that are relevant to what we're experiencing now, not just when it comes to our music, but when it comes to that whole conversation of culture vultures, that also applies to self care as well. So I want you to go back and think about that. I hope this has sparked a conversation for you. And tune into our regular live time, which is Sundays at 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. And I'm going to be having some guests in the new near future, and we'll actually be having some more conversations on that. You can find me on IG at Tonya Taria Health. You can find me on IG there. You can also find me on the Undomesticated Woman podcast on all of your streaming services. So you can find me there as well. But I get a little more radical in terms of what I speak on, and so, welcome to the space. If you're a Black woman, if you're an ally of women in general, particularly Black women, welcome. Otherwise, keep it moving. Till next time. Bye, y'all.